All right, good morning, everybody. Well, we're going to go ahead and get underway here. So thank you so much for joining the webinar this morning. 10 Steps to Dashboarding Success, Leverage the Methods of Google, Apple, and Tesla. So if you're new around here, if you haven't been in a class of mine or joined for a webinar before, just give you a quick background on who I am. So my name is Eric Parker. I live in Seattle, about maybe 10 minutes on a bad day away from the Tableau headquarters. So been working with them in Iterate and teaching students for 5 years now, probably have a couple thousand at this point. And what I really focus on is helping people rapidly solve data preparation and visualization challenges. And that's going to be what we're going to be talking about today, is how to most efficiently solve your most pressing problems. So this kind of whole lead up. So what is it? What is it that Google, Apple, Tesla, and pretty much majority of Fortune 500 companies do now to solve their most pressing problems? And what a lot of them have turned to is a method called design sprints. So we're going to talk about design sprints in a lot of depth. That's what this whole half an hour is going to be catered around. At a high level, a design sprint is a way of reducing the time that it takes to come up with a prototype and eventually to solve a pressing problem at your organization. And so what we've done is, there's books about design sprints. I'll mention a couple as we go if you want to read up some more on your own and see some real world examples of how a company like Apple uses a design sprint to make sure that they're not putting out a rough draft of the iPhone 12 or whatever it would be. We've taken that design sprint methodology and converted it a little bit for the data communication world. This is something that we've been doing with clients for many years now, and I've had it in mind to put together and to be able to start teaching like this for probably at least a year, but just the stars haven't aligned until now. So this is just a quick picture, the 10 steps to performing a successful design sprint. I'm recording this webinar, so if you want to come back later and take some screenshots, you're more than welcome to. But what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get underway and talk through each of these steps, and I'll share some real world examples as well of clients we've worked with and some of the problems that we've solved together. All right, so that very first step, understand the problem. So the first thing when it comes to making sure that we solve a problem is to understand exactly what it is. So being a consultant, I get to kind of go in innocently and ask the basic questions of a business and just try and get to the bottom of problems. These are a few questions we might ask. It's going to depend case by case, but I would say the number one thing to understanding any problem is just to have a curious mindset. Be willing to ask questions, even if they maybe make you feel like you're asking a dumb question. Can be really helpful. Whenever you're trying to solve a problem and build maybe a suite of Tableau dashboards to make some meaningful change, you're essentially creating a new product. So the kind of things I'm trying to keep in mind is who's going to be using this product? What's the problem it's going to solve? What are the issues people are running into right now? How have we tried to solve this in the past? How can we take attempted solutions of the past and learn from those to make this next attempt even better? So to give you an example of this, my colleague Kirk and I were working with an orthopedics clinic recently, and the big problem that it turned out they were trying to solve is they had noticed that their providers' incomes across the board had decreased. And as you can imagine, the doctors at these clinics weren't really that happy about that, right? They're like, wait a second, why am I making less money now than I did last year? And so we went in there just by asking some questions, things like, well, how does pay for doctors generally work at your clinic, right? We have some guesses, but they're probably not salaried if their pay decreased and that was unexpected. So are they all commissioned? Is it partially commissioned? We wanted to get a better understanding of that. We also want to understand what kind of variability could be considered normal. Like, hey, you know what? Maybe it was just a slow summer and just kind of a weird anomaly and pay dipped because of it. Another question we asked was, did any fundamentals in your business change, right? Are you seeing less patients? Has payment plans, payment structures changed? So those were a few of the kinds of questions that we went in and started to ask when we realized that was the problem that we were going to be solving. Okay, step number 2 is involving the right stakeholders. So a key to making sure that your project succeeds is that you have the right people in the room giving you the right kind of feedback. So to give you examples of the kinds of people that might be key stakeholders for your project, these could be people that are going to financially back your project. It could be end users, could be early adopters. This could be people that have different perspectives on the business than you. I think this is really important to make sure that you don't just end up with, 5 accountants in a single design sprint, but you have somebody from marketing, you have somebody from sales, you have somebody from accounting. So you have kind of a variety of perspectives represented. This is just going to make sure that whatever product it is that you're creating gets adopted down the road. And kind of a principle around this is something called ownership bias. And this is this concept that you value something more highly if it's yours. So like, for instance, if anybody here has tried to sell a house, you might think, okay, I'm going to sell this house for $750,000. And, it turns out that the highest offer you get after the home has been on the market for 2 months is $600,000. Well, that would tell you that at least as of right now, the value of that house is not $750,000 like you thought it was. It was $600,000. But we all get emotionally invested in the things that we're close to, whether that's our puppies or our babies or our projects, right? We always think that ours are the best. And so if you can get your key customers, your end users involved early, that's going to make sure that things get adopted more quickly down the road. All right. And actually, just to go back to that last step one more time. So the kind of people, with that orthopedic example I was just sharing, the kind of people we had in the room, initially we started with the CTO and the data analyst. Those were the people that reached out to us and said, hey, this is the problem we're trying to solve. We're looking at Tableau. And we quickly realized those people were great to have. They had a really deep understanding of the data, where we could find the tables that we need, the fields we needed. But we needed some other perspectives on the business as well. So we brought in an accounting analyst that could help speak to payroll. We brought in some of the providers as well, because the providers were really the people that stood to benefit from the project. And we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was addressing their needs. Okay, so step 3, brainstorming and prioritizing a solution. This is a chance to get everybody in the room and start to gain a variety of perspectives. And I think it's really important to clearly define that there is going to be a brainstorming session, because what we've seen happen in the past is things like this. Like, let's say you have 5 people in the room and the CEO says, you know what, I think this is how we're going to solve the problem. Let's do it this way. If you haven't clearly defined that we're going to brainstorm, we want to hear everybody's opinion, a new analyst might not feel comfortable speaking up with something that doesn't exactly correspond and relate to what the CEO just said. But if you said, hey, we want to go around the room, we want to hear about everybody's perspective, and everybody has that floor to speak, you're going to get a more balanced suite of views at the end than just hearing from the loudest or the most powerful person in the room. So if you want to think about it as a question, sometimes the way we phrase this is, what hypotheses do we have, or what possible solutions could help us in overcoming this problem? So back to the orthopedic example, the kinds of things that we started to research and look at were things like, well, has workload changed? You know what, maybe providers, they're just getting older, they don't want to work as much, so they've cut their hours back and aren't doing as many operations anymore. And of course, they would decrease if you're working less, right? Maybe it had to do with referral network. So something we asked about was, well, if you're going to perform an operation, where do these people come from? How do you hear about them? How do they hear about you? How do they sign up? Turned out that really comes down to primary care providers, saying, hey, you have this issue. This is who I'd recommend you see. And we also asked about payment. So what we learned through that brainstorm was that they were seeing a lot more Medicare patients, which we'll talk about it in a little bit, but that did have an effect on the bottom line for those providers. Okay. Step number 4, whiteboarding a solution. whiteboarding, very important. It's really easy to skip this step and be like, yeah, okay, whiteboarding, whatever. Here's why whiteboarding is really important. We have 5 senses, right? We got sight, taste, touch, smell, feel. I think I got all 5. And of those 5, 80% of all impressions that we have as humans comes through our sense of sight. So what that means is that that's far and away our strongest form of communication. For anybody here that played the game Telephone as a kid, you probably know how this works. You know, maybe the first person whispered macaroni and cheese, and then it got passed around to 12 different people. And by the time it got back to you, it was Tropicana Breeze. And you're like, how did this happen? That's not even close to what it was. And so to give you an example, here's something that I see happen pretty often. Somebody will say, hey, I need a chart that allows me to compare sales goal performance for each state. I want to know what states met their sales goals and which didn't this year. So an analyst would be like, cool, it sounds like a map to me, so I'll go ahead and build this. And then get this back to somebody and they say, well, that's not really what I wanted. How am I supposed to sort, rank, compare? A map's not good for that. So what they really wanted was maybe something like a bar chart. But the way they described it was they just wanted a chart that showed which states met their goals and which didn't. So you can see how quickly these kind of things get morphed. And in the big picture, this can be really problematic and disastrous, because if you think you're on the same page with somebody after brainstorming and prioritizing, and you end up going down the wrong road, maybe you're chasing the wrong data sources, building the wrong kinds of things, that could be days, weeks, and on a really high side, maybe even months of work lost, because you go, okay, I need to get access to this data. Okay, the data's in these tables. I need to understand these. I'm going to combine and transform these tables. I'm going to clean this data. I'm going to build these visuals. And before you know it, you've invested a ton of time and energy only to potentially find out that's not really what the group was thinking. So whiteboarding, really important to save you a lot of time. Doesn't have to take that long. This could be as little as like 20 or 30 minutes to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, step 5 is going to be creating a prototype. So this, again, doesn't have to be a long step. I would say in your ideal world, this prototype might even take a day or less. The prototype is also really important because it allows you to start getting feedback on your ideas from your potential end users right away. So that you don't have to say, okay, in a couple months, we'll have something, we'll show it to you then. The other thing is you just don't want to lose steam. At this point, you've gotten stakeholders together, you've discussed the problem, you've come up with a possible solution, you've whiteboarded it. You don't want to say, all right, well, check back in 2 months when we've got something. No, like you want to have something as soon as possible. And probably the biggest barrier that I hear people talk about at this stage is, well, the data's not ready. It's complex. I don't have access to it. It's not clean. So here's a couple ideas. First of all, you could just use an export. You don't have to have all of your data in a production-ready format. If you can access your application and just say, yeah, I'm going to export to Excel, or I'm going to export to a CSV, you could use that for your prototype. You don't want to tell your end users, hey, this doesn't have all of the data in it. It's an example, but that can work. If even that's not possible, you're like, you know what, I can't even get an export of the data. It's so locked down. You can just make up your own data. We've actually done that a number of times. One of my favorite tools for that is called Mockaroo, MOCKAROO.com. And it allows you to generate realistic looking prototype data that is really useful for putting together a quick solution like this. Okay, and this is actually an example of that. So this is an example of a prototype where we used exported data. This whole prototype took us probably a day to put together the first time, got some feedback and updated it. This is probably a 2-day prototype. And I think how people usually think about prototypes is a chart like this. So, okay, hey, it's kind of a linear process. It's going to take time. Finally, when we're 80, 90% of the way through our project, that's when we can show people the prototype. And so that's how a sort of normal product build works. But in a design sprint, you want to think about it more like this. Okay, you're going to get that prototype off the ground as fast as possible. And yeah, it's going to take time down the road to be able to work out the kinks, the engineering solutions, getting the data ready, but you want to get your prototype off the ground as soon as possible. That looks good, it looks realistic, to be able to start getting that feedback. Because again, you might find out, you know what, we thought we were going to go down this road, but it turns out we're actually going to pivot on that. And you don't want to have invested months of effort before you find that. Just got a question, what was the prototype site? It's called Mockaroo, MOCKAROO.com. And I'll go ahead and I'll link that up as well when I send out a follow-up email. Also, these charts I'm referencing right now, they come from a book called Sprint by Jake Knapp. He works with Google Ventures, and they've helped spin off a bunch of companies like DocuSign and Slack. So if you want to look at some more examples of how design sprints work for other products rather than just Tableau dashboards or data communication projects, feel free to check out that book. Recommend it. Okay, so you've built a prototype. Your next step is going to be receiving feedback from people and going through iterations to make your product better. You're probably going to go through this cycle several times. What I would say is you want to get feedback from a wide variety of people, but you don't want to get stuck in this infinite loop of feedback, right? And here is also just kind of a piece of advice that I found to be helpful. If you built the dashboards, you want to be careful when you're soliciting feedback, because like anything, it's really easy to get defensive. If you're saying, hey, you know, I'm really looking for your feedback, would love to hear if this works for you, what's good, what's not. And somebody says, well, you know, I found this part to be a little bit confusing. If you built it, I'm guilty of this too. You might get kind of defensive and say, well, you know, you just click here and that's how it works, right? But if you have a somewhat independent third party getting feedback, they could say something like, hey, I'm helping solicit feedback for this product. We want to make sure that it's going to work well for our end users. I didn't build it. I'm just helping gather feedback for the designers, and then I'm going to give to them. The more frank your feedback can be, the better. We want to hear what's great about it and what's hard about it. That's going to give the person who is giving the feedback a lot more freedom to be able to share their mind freely, so they don't, hurt your feelings or, say something too frank and make you get defensive. And what I would say is you're going to get a lot of feedback, depending on how many people. You probably want feedback from at least 3 to 5 users, depending on the size of your audience. And I would say you're probably not going to be able to cater to every request, but you're probably going to want to use some of the best ideas as part of your next iteration. And if you're having trouble, you're like, oh, I got 30 ideas. How do I even approach this? The question I would ask is this going to help solve the fundamental problem that we're after? If it is, then great, let's include it. If it's not, or it's kind of ancillary information, maybe we'll save that for a project on a future date. Okay, step number 7, validating. So when it comes to validation, here's the main idea. So let me run you through a completely fake scenario, but it's going to help be a good illustration for what can happen. Let's say that Airbus comes out with a new type of airplane, and it's the very first inaugural run. It's a transatlantic flight, and the plane crashes and everybody dies. Like, horrible, horrific tragedy. Do you think that the airline companies of the world are going to be knocking down Airbus's door to get some of those planes? Like, no, probably not. They probably will try and steer clear of that. It's a PR nightmare. Everybody will probably think it's an engineering flaw. Well, what if a month later, it just turns out, that pilot didn't do his pre-flight check. The altimeter wasn't working correctly. If he had just done his pre-flight check, this wouldn't have happened. Still, even if that was the case, public opinion's already been formed, and it's going to be really hard to basically dig out of that hole. That same thing happens with new product launches all the time. I'm sure you can think of things that you bought that were not good. And what you don't want to do is to have your data communication project go down that same path. Let's say that, you are launching some Tableau dashboards that are going to solve a problem to a new part of your organization that hasn't really worked with something like that before. And their first feedback is, this data is wrong. This is incorrect. This isn't going to work for me, right? Now, it might be something simple. You might just be able to go back and like, oh, it's just this one calculation, just going to change this and everything's going to work. That's great that you can fix it quickly, but it's already gotten off on the wrong foot and lost a lot of credibility with people. So take this extra step, take this time, whether it's an Excel file, raw data directly from your database, alternative reports that you can generate. As best as possible, try to validate your facts and figures against something that's considered truth by the organization at large to make sure that you don't end up in this sort of train wreck scenario. Okay, step number 8, and this is where a lot of people stop this journey, is deploying your work. So maybe you feel good about it, you're ready to launch it to the world, and you publish it to server, or you email it out, or you publish it to Tableau Public. That's great. I will tell you that I personally am a pretty achievement-oriented person. So once I'm done with the project, I like to kind of like, dust my hands, move on to the next thing. If you stop here though, you're going to miss out on making sure that this product is widely used and adopted by a greater audience. Okay? So again, very tempting to stop here, try to override your internal drive to just be done with it. And step 9 is going to be training people on what it is that you've created. So if all you do is deploy it, here you're the initiator, you're this little dot here on the left side, you maybe will get that innovator group to take off with it, right? Unless you have a really mature audience. This is kind of more for newer audiences to Tableau dashboards, data communication projects. So the problem is, if you're not there to help train and make sure that people understand what you're doing, get on board with it, this adoption curve is going to move extremely slowly and potentially even stall out really early on. So, but if you're there to help train people, that's going to be help speed up this whole cycle. So here's a few different ways that you can consider training, right? Number 1, in person. You might have, somebody who's not terribly technologically savvy, like this guy here, and, need some help with what you do. If it's a small group of end users, in-person training is probably the most credible way to train people. What I mean by that is you're in person, you can answer questions, they get to see that you know what you're talking about. If there's a problem that you spot right away, you can fix it. So in-person training is great for small groups and especially for inexperienced users. In our day and age, sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not. Another possibility for training would be performing virtual training, right? So if your audience is dispersed geographically or different offices, or there's just a really large group, maybe you just speak with those key people, those early adopters that are going to be the first dominoes to fall, and you just schedule 15 minutes with them to be able to walk through your new product, coach them up on how it works. Right? Option number 3 would be actually recording a training video. There are a variety of free video capture softwares you can use to get a screen capture. So let me show you how I've set this kind of process up in the past. What you can do is in a Tableau dashboard, you can provide a link, like this little button right here. And when I select that, it actually takes me out to a dashboard on Vimeo. And it's a couple-minute walkthrough explaining how this dashboard works, why it's created, the problems that it solves. If you have a really large group, like let's say you've got 50 or 100 or 1,000 people, you're not going to be able to work with them all one-on-one. So creating something like this is a great way to make sure that you're still able to get your message out to a wider audience and to potentially create a feedback loop for yourself. You want to provide your email address here. It's a great place to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. Okay, and one more training option that you have would just be creating a training image. So this is something that I do on a somewhat regular basis. Depends on the maturity of the audience and the technical capabilities of the dashboard. So in this case, all I've done, screenshotted the dashboard, took it to PowerPoint, dropped some shapes and some comments in there so that when somebody opens up the Tableau workbook, that's their first thing. Like this is the first dashboard. All it is just an image that I pulled in, but it just tells them this is how this works. So that when they get to this page, they're already ready. They're prepped. Okay, I know this filter does this. I know that selecting these bars does that. All right. So Step number 10, our last step in our design sprint process, is going to be managing the work that you've created. So here's the thing. People's needs and desires are going to change over time. If you have any sort of Tableau server administrator capabilities, what you can do is you can check usage logs to see how often dashboards are accessed. If you noticed, hey, this dashboard got 500 hits a month when it started, we're 6 months down the road and now it gets 5 hits a month, something's happened, right? It could be a data issue. It could be that your users' needs changed. So you want to try and check in, manage your work. I would say maybe try and set yourself a little bit of time each month to do a review, see if what you've built is still helping answer questions for people. And so there's a few things. Your users' needs could change. Your skills are going to change, right? Ideally, your technical capabilities and your understanding of Tableau and the different products you work with are going to get better, so that things that you thought were impossible 3 months ago, you might now know how to do. The other thing is Tableau is going to change. They just released a new version yesterday. So they're continually releasing new versions with different capabilities. So trying to take advantage of that and make things as usable for your end users, keeping them up to date, really important step. Okay, so those are our 10 steps. If you're wondering like what ended up happening with that orthopedic clinic, that is a very fair question. So what happened is the orthopedic clinic realized there was a variety of factors that was leading to their provider's income decreasing. There was a little bit of a workload change. That was primarily due to the fact that they weren't getting nearly as many leads as before. And their payment per operation on average went down because they were accepting more Medicare patients. So what they realized they needed to do was to increase the number of operations they were performing and become more efficient at that. So they reconnected with old primary care providers they'd lost touch with, made new contacts with other primary care providers, and were able to increase their lead flow to be able to take better advantage of their providers' time and skill sets. And that led to their providers' incomes returning to, and even in a lot of cases, exceeding the levels they were at previously. So, there was some learning along the way. It wasn't, 100% straight line, but ended up that everybody was really happy. And by going through this process, we were able to help solve that problem. And now they're on to their next design sprint. So if you're wondering, like, what now? What are you supposed to do with all of this? A few ideas. First of all, feel free to do a design sprint on your own. Like I said, I'm recording this. You'll be able to come back and watch this again. I've left a book recommendation in here. If you want to study some design sprints and perform them for yourself, solve problems in your organization, would highly recommend that. If you feel like this was just the tip of the iceberg and you want to dive into this in more detail, we've got a workshop that we're hosting 1 month from now called Tableau Dashboarding from Mystery to Mastery. It's going to be a day and a half of basically taking this half-an-hour content that we just talked about, diving in a lot more detail. We're going to speak to design sprints, share some examples, share some technical tricks that you might need to take your dashboarding and your projects to the next level. So that's a great resource. And if you try those and you just say, hey, we're just too strapped for time, we don't have the time to develop these skills and expertise or try this one number, just do it. We just want you to run this for us. We can do that as well. And I'll provide my email address so that you can reach out directly. So that is our content for this webinar. It looks like we're at about 9:30, so if you have to peel off, totally understand that. I do want to leave about 2 minutes to answer, probably have time for 2 questions. So if there are any immediate questions that have come up, feel free to type those in to the questions dialog on the little GoToWebinar menu, or if that's not really working, if you raise your hand, I might be able to figure out how to unmute you. So I'll just leave a little bit of silence now for anybody that wants to take time to form a question. All right, well, oh, no, I do have something. All right, here we go. Here's the question. Do you find you have to circle through the whiteboard/prototype steps a few times before moving on? That can happen. It's going to depend on the audience. So if you have a wide group of users, probably going to take a little bit longer to get through it. I would say with whiteboarding, what I end up doing is I draw something and then I get some feedback, kind of immediate feedback from people. So I end up erasing half of it and drawing something else. What I try to do is to only go through the whiteboarding step one time, even if that requires some erasing and redrawing. And then with the prototype step, that I would say that's not uncommon to go through a couple iterations of that as well, to get that initial feedback on the prototype and then refine it so that when you go into actually creating the dashboard and putting it into production, you're headed in the right direction versus thinking that it's production ready, then getting the feedback you could have gotten at the prototype step. So that's a great question. There's another one that said, recently I rolled out a dashboard, took feedback and revamped, and users committed to using it for 90 days and then setting a follow-up meeting. That's another great way to do it. So, rather than just launching it, walking away, never touching it again, part of that management step could say, hey, let's revisit this in 1 quarter from now and see if this is still working and what we want to change. I think that's a great recommendation, a great way of setting it up. So yeah, thanks, Kelly. That's awesome. Okay, so that is what we have time for today. Thanks so much for joining. If you are watching a recording of this and you have questions that came up or we just didn't have time to address your questions today, please do feel free to email me. My email address is eric.parker@onenumber.biz, and I will try to have this recording out as soon as possible, hopefully by the end of the day today. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate you being here and look forward to talking to you soon.